The stagecoach wheel caught another rut, jolting Clara Belle Holloway against the wooden frame for what felt like the 100th time since leaving Kansas City. She pressed her gloved hand to her ribs, certain she'd find bruises blooming beneath her traveling dress come evening. The driver had made it clear from the start that he considered her presence an imposition, though she'd paid full fare like any other passenger. "Ma'am, with all due respect," the grizzled man had said when she'd tried to make conversation about the landscape. "Most ladies know when to let a man concentrate on his work." That had been 3 days ago. Now, as the Nebraska plains stretched endlessly before them, Clara had learned to keep her observations about the wildflowers, the cloud formations, and the distant mountains to herself. She'd learned, as she always did, to make herself smaller. The letter in her valise had arrived 6 weeks prior, offering salvation in the form of employment. The Weatherby children in Ash Hollow needed a governess. Their guardian, a distant uncle who ran the local general store, had advertised back east for someone with proper education. Clara's credentials from the Boston Normal School had impressed him enough to send coach fare. She hadn't mentioned that she was fleeing more than seeking, that Charles Pemberton had stood in her mother's parlor just 2 months ago, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger, declaring their engagement dissolved. "You're simply too much, Clara," he'd said, as if diagnosing an illness. "Too eager with your opinions, too quick to speak at gatherings, too passionate about matters that don't concern a lady. I need a wife who understands restraint." Her mother had wept. Her father had refused to meet her eyes. And Clara had packed her belongings that very night, answering an advertisement she'd seen in the Boston Globe the week before. The stagecoach lurched to a sudden stop, throwing Clara forward. Through the dust-caked window, she saw nothing but sagebrush and red dirt, no station, no town, just emptiness. The driver climbed down from his perch and yanked open her door. "End of the line for you, miss." Clara's heart hammered against her corset stays. "I beg your pardon, Ash Hollow is still 20 miles west." "That it is." He spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "But I've had enough of your sighing and shifting and making noise every time we hit a bump. You're disturbing my concentration. Walking might teach you some quiet. You can't simply abandon me." "I can and I will." He hauled her trunk from the boot and dropped it unceremoniously in the dust. "There's a wagon trail yonder. Someone will be along eventually. Maybe they'll have more patience for a woman who don't know when to be still." Clara stood in the swirling dust as the stagecoach disappeared over a rise, her traveling dress already collecting the fine red powder that seemed to coat everything in this God-forsaken territory. The sun blazed overhead, and she had perhaps 2 hours of water in her canteen. She should have been terrified, should have wept, should have done any number of things a proper lady would do when abandoned in the wilderness. Instead, Clara Belle Holloway laughed. It started as a chuckle, then grew into something wild and free that echoed across the empty plains. Here she was, cast out for being too much, and she couldn't even manage to stay quiet long enough to reach her destination. If this wasn't proof of Charles's assessment, she didn't know what was. She dragged her trunk to a large rock that offered a small pool of shade and sat down to think. The wagon trail the driver had mentioned was visible, 2 pale lines through the scrub grass. Someone would come. They had to. An hour passed. The sun shifted. Clara rationed her water and tried not to think about rattlesnakes or wolves or the dozens of other dangers her Eastern newspapers had delighted in describing. She unpinned her hat and used it to fan herself, then gave up on propriety altogether and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of her high collar. When the tears finally came, they were angry ones. Angry at Charles for making her feel monstrous for simply being herself. Angry at her parents for agreeing with him. Angry at the driver for confirming what everyone seemed to believe, that she was simply too much trouble to tolerate. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up, shading her eyes with her hand. A lone rider approached from the east, moving at an easy pace that suggested no particular urgency. As he drew closer, Clara could make out details: a bay horse, well cared for despite the dust, and a rider who sat his saddle like he'd been born to it. The man reined in a few feet away, pushing his hat back to reveal a face that had seen its share of sun and wind. Young still, perhaps 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. He studied her for a long moment. Her trunk, her disheveled appearance, her very obvious abandonment, but asked no questions. Instead, he swung down from his saddle and pulled a canteen from his saddlebags. "You look like you could use some water." Clara accepted it gratefully, trying not to gulp. The water was warm but clean, with a faint taste of metal from the container. When she handed it back, she found him watching her with something that might have been amusement. "Thank you," she said. "I'm afraid the stage driver found my presence objectionable." "That's so." He leaned against his horse, apparently in no hurry. "Let me guess. Too much talking, too much moving, too much of something he couldn't put his finger on but didn't like anyway." Clara stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Because you're sitting in the middle of nowhere with your collar unbuttoned and dust in your hair. And instead of crying or fainting, you look mad enough to spit nails. That's usually the kind of woman that makes weak men nervous." "I was crying," Clara admitted, "earlier." "Nothing wrong with that. Question is, were you crying because you're scared or because you're angry?" Clara considered this. "Angry, I think. I'm very tired of being told I'm too much." The stranger nodded as if this made perfect sense. "You lost, or just tired of being told to be less?" The question hung in the air between them. Clara felt something inside her chest crack open, like ice breaking on a spring river. "Both," she whispered. "I'm meant to be in Ash Hollow. I have a position there, teaching the Weatherby children." "I know the Weatherbys. Good people, even if the uncle's a bit stiff." He straightened. Decision made. "Name's Micah Ridge. I've got business in Ash Hollow myself. Seems foolish to leave you here when we're heading the same direction." "Clara Halloway." She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. "I appreciate the offer, but I couldn't impose my trunk alone. Ma'am, in about 2 hours, this spot's going to be hotter than a baker's oven. In 4 hours, the wolves start getting curious. And in 6 hours, you'll be trying to find your way in the dark." He moved to her trunk, testing its weight. "This isn't about imposing. It's about good sense." He was right, of course. Clara helped him secure her trunk to his saddle, grateful that he didn't comment on its weight or contents. When he offered her his hand to mount, she hesitated. "I should mention," she said, "that I've been told I'm difficult company. I speak too freely and have opinions on subjects I shouldn't, and—" "Miss Halloway," he cut her off gently. "I've ridden from here to California and back. I've heard every kind of story under the sun. If you want to talk, talk. If you want to sing, sing. Hell, if you want to recite poetry backwards, I won't stop you. But right now, we need to move." Clara took his hand and let him help her up behind the saddle. She arranged her skirts as modestly as possible and tried not to think about the impropriety of riding double with a stranger. As they set off toward Ash Hollow, Micah Ridge said something that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. "For what it's worth, Miss Halloway, I've found that the people who complain about others being too much are usually just too small themselves to hold anything bigger than their own fears." Clara held onto the back of his saddle and watched the endless sky stretch above them. For the first time since Charles had broken their engagement, she felt like she could breathe. Ash Hollow revealed itself just as the sun began its descent behind the distant bluffs, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. Clara's first glimpse of her new home came as they crested a small rise, a collection of wooden buildings huddled along a single main street, surrounded by endless prairie. It looked exactly like what it was, a town clinging to existence through sheer stubbornness. Micah guided his horse down the dusty main street, and Clara became acutely aware of the eyes following their progress. Women paused in their sweeping to stare from doorways. Men lounging outside the saloon straightened up, their conversations dying mid-sentence. By the time they reached Weatherby's general store, it seemed the entire population of Ash Hollow had found reason to be outdoors. "Interesting welcome," Clara murmured. "Small towns," Micah replied quietly. "A new face is better than a traveling show." He dismounted first, then helped her down. Clara's legs, stiff from the long ride, nearly buckled. Micah's hand steadied her elbow until she found her balance, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by their audience. The door to the general store flew open, and a thin man with pomaded hair stepped out. "Miss Halloway, we expected you on the afternoon stage." "There was a slight complication with my travel arrangements, Mr. Weatherby." Clara smoothed her dusty skirts. "Fortunately, Mr. Ridge was kind enough to assist me." Theodore Weatherby's pale eyes shifted between them, clearly calculating the impropriety of the situation. "I see. Well, most irregular." He turned to Micah with barely concealed disapproval. "Thank you. Ridge, I'll take it from here." Micah touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Halloway." "To Weatherby," he added. "I'll be by tomorrow about that order we discussed." He led his horse away without looking back, and Clara felt oddly bereft. She'd known the man less than 4 hours, but he'd been the first person in months to suggest she didn't need fixing. "Come along then," Weatherby said briskly. "The children are eager to meet you. Though I should mention, we run a quiet household. The last governess found our ways quite agreeable, very peaceful, very proper." Clara followed him through the store, past shelves of dry goods and farming implements, to a narrow staircase leading to the living quarters above. With each step, she felt the walls closing in. The Weatherby children were waiting in a small parlor that smelled of lemon oil and disappointment. Margaret, age 10, sat with her hands folded and her back rigid. Timothy, 8, stared at his shoes. Both children looked as if they'd been starched and pressed like their uncle's shirt collars. "Children, this is Miss Halloway," Weatherby announced. "Miss Halloway, my wards." Clara knelt to their level, ignoring the dust she was spreading on the clean floor. "Hello, Margaret. Timothy, what shall we learn about first geography literature? Perhaps some natural sciences." Margaret's eyes flickered with interest before her expression returned to careful blankness. "Uncle Theodore says ladies shouldn't trouble themselves with sciences." "Does he now?" Clara kept her voice light. "Well, perhaps we'll start with something else then. What do you enjoy?" "We enjoy quiet activities," Margaret recited. "Reading improving texts, copying Bible verses, needlework." "I see." Clara stood slowly. "And you, Timothy, what captures your imagination?" The boy glanced at his uncle before mumbling, "Nothing, miss." Weatherby nodded approvingly. "Good children, very well behaved. You'll find them no trouble at all, provided you maintain proper discipline. Lessons run from 8 to noon. Then the children help in the store. Evenings are for quiet reflection." He showed her to a small room at the back of the building. Clean, sparse, with a narrow bed and a washstand. Her trunk had already been delivered, sitting like an accusation in the corner. "Breakfast is at 7 sharp," Weatherby continued. "I trust you'll freshen up before joining us. And Miss Halloway, we attend church services twice on Sundays and prayer meeting Wednesday evenings. I expect you'll set a proper example." When he finally left, Clara sank onto the bed and wondered if she'd escaped one cage only to fly directly into another. The next morning, she dressed in her most conservative gray dress and pinned her hair severely back. At breakfast, she spoke only when addressed. During lessons, she kept to the approved curriculum, penmanship, basic arithmetic, and readings from McGuffey's Reader. The children remained politely distant, their spirits as buttoned up as their clothes. By the third day, Clara felt like she might scream. It was Margaret who cracked first, during their geography lesson, as Clara pointed out the territories on a faded map. The girl suddenly asked, "Have you been to any of these places?" "Miss Halloway, I've traveled from Boston," Clara admitted carefully. "I've seen quite a bit of the country from the coach window." "What was it like?" Timothy leaned forward, forgetting his practiced posture. "Did you see any Indians or buffalo?" "Timothy," Margaret hissed. "Uncle says—" "Your uncle isn't here," Clara said gently. "And yes, I did see buffalo. A small herd, like moving mountains against the horizon. For the next 10 minutes, she let herself describe the journey. The changing landscapes, the fellow travelers, even the adventure of being abandoned on the trail. The children hung on every word, their faces animated for the first time since she'd arrived. The shop bell chimed below, and both children immediately straightened, masks sliding back into place. Footsteps on the stairs announced Weatherby's approach. "I trust lessons are proceeding quietly," he said from the doorway. "Of course," Clara replied. "We were just discussing the importance of maintaining proper boundaries." He nodded and retreated. The moment stretched between Clara and the children, heavy with unspoken understanding. That evening, Clara took her daily walk, the only freedom Weatherby grudgingly allowed, for her health. She'd discovered a small grove of cottonwoods by the creek where she could breathe without feeling watched. She was sitting on a fallen log, watching the water ripple, when she heard hoofbeats. Micah Ridge appeared through the trees, leading his horse to drink. "Miss Halloway," he touched his hat. "How are you finding Ash Hollow?" "Educational," Clara said dryly. "I'm learning a great deal about the importance of being quiet, still, and generally invisible." He tied his horse to a branch and sat on the log, maintaining a respectful distance. "The Weatherby children." "Delightful, when they forget to be afraid." She picked at a piece of bark. "Their uncle has them trained like circus ponies. One misstep and they freeze. He means well, in his way. Lost his brother and sister-in-law to fever 2 years back. Thinks if he keeps those kids wrapped tight enough, nothing bad can touch them. He's suffocating them." "Maybe." Micah stretched his legs out. "But you telling him that won't change his mind. Just get you fired, and those kids a governess who thinks even less than you do." Clara knew he was right, but it didn't ease the frustration. "I suppose you think I should keep my opinions to myself, too." "Never said that." He pulled out a knife and a piece of wood, began whittling. "Just thinking you might find other ways to let those kids breathe. Ways that don't look like rebellion to a frightened man." They sat in comfortable silence while he carved. Clara found herself studying his hands, steady, patient, creating something from nothing. When he finally spoke again, his voice was thoughtful. "You know what I notice about you, Miss Halloway. You don't just talk too much or feel too much. You hope too much. You look at those shut-down kids and see who they could be. That's not a failing. That's just rare." Clara felt tears threaten. "Mr. Ridge." "Micah," he corrected. "And I'm not finished. This town's full of people who've learned to make themselves small. Some, like Weatherby, do it out of fear. Others do it because it's easier than fighting. But you're fighting even when you're trying not to." "And losing," Clara added bitterly. "Are you?" He held up the piece of wood, a small bird beginning to emerge from the grain. "Seems to me those kids were different today. Saw them through the window when I came for my order. They were leaning forward, eyes bright. That's not losing." He stood, pocketing the half-carved bird. "You don't have to shrink yourself down to nothing. Clara, just maybe find ways to expand that don't look like explosions to folks who are scared of loud noises." He untied his horse and swung up into the saddle. "I'll be back in town Saturday. There's a good spot by Miller's Pond where the wildflowers are blooming. Might be educational for children to see, if someone were to take them on a nature walk after their morning lessons." Clara watched him ride away, something warm unfurling in her chest. When she returned to the house, she found Margaret and Timothy finishing their evening chores. "Children," she said quietly, How would you like to learn about the local flora this Saturday for scientific purposes? Of course. The look they exchanged was pure conspiracy. Margaret nodded solemnly. That sounds very educational. Miss Halloway, for the first time since arriving in Ash Hollow. Clara smiled genuinely. Perhaps there was more than one way to be too much. Perhaps the trick was learning how to spill over carefully, like water finding its way through stone. The transformation was subtle at first. Clara learned to speak in questions rather than declarations. Instead of saying, "The earth revolves around the sun," she would ask Margaret, "What do you suppose would happen if the sun circled us instead?" The girl's eyes would light up as she puzzled through the logic, arriving at understanding on her own terms. With Timothy, she discovered that his love of numbers could be channeled through practical mathematics, calculating supplies needed for the store, measuring rainfall in a jar she placed behind the building. Theodore Weatherby saw only his nephew helping with ledgers and maintaining useful records. He didn't see the boy's joy in discovering patterns and relationships between numbers. But the effort of constant restraint wore on Clara like water on stone. Each night, she would lie in her narrow bed and feel pieces of herself going quiet, folding inward like flowers at dusk. Her laughter, once bright and sudden, became a small smile. Her gestures, previously expansive, shrunk to fit the confines of proper femininity. The Saturday nature walks became her lifeline, true to his word. Micah would appear at Miller's Pond with his quiet presence and steady humor. The children would scatter to collect specimens while Clara and Micah sat on the bank, talking about everything and nothing. "You're dimming," he told her one afternoon, 3 weeks into their routine. Clara was watching Margaret chase a butterfly, her usually severe braids coming undone. "I'm adapting." "That what you call it?" He skimmed a stone across the water. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're disappearing." "It's working, isn't it, mister? Weatherby hasn't complained once this week. The children are learning. Everyone's happy." "Everyone?" Clara didn't answer. She couldn't explain how it felt to swallow words before they formed, to catch herself mid-gesture and pull back, to smile small when she wanted to laugh large. She couldn't tell him about the dreams where she was shouting into wind that stole her voice. "There's a barn dance next Friday," Micah said after a long silence. "Nothing fancy. Just neighbors, music, probably terrible punch. You should come." "Mr. Weatherby would never—" "I already asked him. Told him it would be good for the children to see proper social comportment. He agreed, provided you serve as appropriate supervision." Clara turned to stare at him. "You asked Theodore Weatherby to let me attend a barn dance. Seemed like you could use a place to be loud for a few hours." He stood, brushing off his pants. "Besides, I need a partner who won't step on my feet. My boots are getting too old for that kind of abuse." The week leading to the dance crawled by. Clara found herself both anticipating and dreading it. She'd loved dancing in Boston, the swirl of music and movement, the joy of letting rhythm carry her body. But that was before Charles, before she'd learned that her enthusiasm was unbecoming. She chose her blue dress, the one she'd worn to her cousin's wedding. It was 2 years out of fashion, but still pretty, with small pearl buttons and lace at the collar. As she helped Margaret into her best frock, the girl asked quietly, "Will you dance, Miss Halloway?" "Perhaps 1 or 2 times, properly, of course." Margaret bit her lip. "I heard Mrs. Morrison saying that you had opinions about things ladies shouldn't." Clara's hand stilled on the girl's buttons. "What do you think, Margaret?" "I think—" The girl turned, her young face serious. "I think having opinions means you're paying attention. And isn't that what you teach us, to pay attention?" Clara hugged her quickly, before either of them could cry. The barn belonged to the Hendersons, a sprawling family who seemed to comprise half of Ash Hollow's population. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm light over the assembled crowd. A small band fiddle, guitar, and harmonica was tuning up in the corner. The air smelled of hay and apple cider and the peculiar excitement that comes from ordinary people allowing themselves a celebration. Clara stood with the children near the punch bowl, watching couples take the floor. She nodded politely to the women who acknowledged her, ignored the whispers that followed. Boston, too educated. Poor Weatherby, managing that handful. She was so focused on being invisible that she didn't notice Micah until he was beside her. He'd traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt and dark pants. His hair was slicked back, revealing the strong lines of his face. "Miss Halloway, you planning to guard that punch bowl all night? The children are currently being taught to play checkers by Tom Henderson." He gestured to where Timothy and Margaret were indeed engrossed in a game with the Henderson boys. "Which means you're officially relieved of duty." The fiddle struck up a reel. Micah extended his hand. "Dance with me." "I don't think." "That's the point. Don't think, just dance." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, then at the faces around them. Some curious, some disapproving misses. Morrison was already leaning toward her companion, lips moving in what was surely commentary. Then she thought of Margaret's words, paying attention, having opinions, being alive. She took his hand. The first few steps were tentative. Clara's body remembered the movements, but her mind kept intruding. "Stay small, don't smile too wide, don't let your skirts fly too high." But Micah was a strong lead, and the music was insistent, and gradually, inevitably, Clara began to forget. She forgot to be careful, forgot to be contained. The dance floor became her entire world, the press of Micah's palm against hers, the swing and sway of the rhythm, the laughter that bubbled up from somewhere deep in her chest. When he spun her, she let her head tip back. When the music quickened, she matched it with abandon. One dance became 2, then 3. Other couples joined and left the floor, but Clara barely noticed. She was drunk on movement, on the simple joy of taking up space without apology. Her hair began to escape its pins. Her cheeks flushed. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. It was during a brief pause between songs that reality crashed back. The barn had gone notably quiet. Clara became aware of the stares, the tight mouths, the women pulling their daughters back as if enthusiasm were contagious. "Oh," she breathed, suddenly seeing herself through their eyes. Hair wild, dress disheveled, face glowing with improper joy. "Oh no." She pulled away from Micah, already shrinking. "I should the children." "Clara," his voice was firm. "Don't." But she was already moving, crossing to where Margaret and Timothy watched with wide eyes. "Come," she said, her voice strange and tight. "It's time we returned home." The walk back to the store felt endless. The children were silent, sensing her distress. Clara's mind raced with consequences. Weatherby's disappointment, possible dismissal, another failure to be the right kind of woman. At the door, Margaret suddenly grabbed her hand. "You were beautiful," the girl whispered fiercely. "When you danced, you were the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Clara squeezed her hand and said nothing, afraid her voice would break. Inside, Weatherby waited in the parlor, his face unreadable. "Children, to bed. Miss Halloway, a word." The children reluctantly climbed the stairs. Clara stood before her employer like a penitent, hands clasped, waiting for the axe to fall. "I've had 3 different people approach me tonight." Weatherby began slowly, "to inform me of your display." Mr. Weatherby, I apologize. I forgot myself. It won't happen again." "No," he agreed. "It won't, because if it does, I'll have no choice but to find someone more suitable for my wards. Someone who understands the importance of setting a proper example." Clara nodded. Each word another stone in the wall she'd have to rebuild around herself. "You may go." She climbed the stairs to her room, closed the door, and finally let the tears fall. Not sad tears. Exactly. Angry ones. Frustrated ones. The tears of someone who'd tasted freedom and had it snatched away. A soft knock interrupted her crying. She opened the door to find Margaret and Timothy in their night clothes, faces anxious. "We brought you this," Timothy whispered, producing a slightly crumpled wildflower from behind his back. "From our walks." Margaret pressed it in her Bible. "We want you to stay," Margaret added. "But not like Uncle wants. We liked you better before, when you were too much." Clara knelt and pulled them both into a hug, not caring that it was improper. "Sometimes," she whispered, "being too much is dangerous." "But isn't being too little dangerous too?" Margaret asked, just in a different way. Clara had no answer for that. She sent them back to bed and sat at her window, looking out at the vast prairie sky. Somewhere out there, Micah Ridge was probably tending his horse or mending tack, untroubled by the chaos he'd helped create. "Don't shrink for them," he'd said, but he didn't understand the cost of taking up space in a world that preferred its women pressed flat as flowers in a Bible. Or maybe he did. Maybe that's why he'd asked her to dance in the first place. Clara touched the wildflower the children had given her. Tomorrow, she would wake early. She would pin her hair severely and speak softly and be exactly what Theodore Weatherby required. But tonight, in the privacy of her small room, she let herself remember how it felt to spin without calculating the distance, to laugh without measuring the volume, to be entirely, unapologetically herself, even if it was just for 3 dances, even if it cost her everything, even if it was too much. The days after the barn dance passed in careful quietness. Clara moved through her duties like a ghost, speaking only when necessary, keeping her hands folded and her eyes downcast. The children watched her with worried faces, but she could offer them no reassurance. She was too busy disappearing. The Saturday nature walks ceased when Margaret tentatively asked about visiting Miller's Pond. Clara shook her head. "We must focus on your studies. Your uncle is right. There's been too much distraction lately." She didn't see Micah for a full week. When he finally appeared at the store to collect an order, Clara was teaching arithmetic in the parlor. She heard his voice through the floorboards, low and steady, conducting business with Weatherby. Her heart hammered traitorously, but she kept her attention fixed on Timothy's sums. The second week was harder. Clara found herself listening for hoofbeats, watching the window despite herself. The children grew increasingly subdued, their brief spark of rebellion fading back into obedient silence. Even worse, Clara could feel herself accepting it, the smallness, the quiet, the careful control. It was easier than fighting, easier than wanting things she couldn't have. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. Weatherby had gone to the next town for supplies, leaving Clara with strict instructions to maintain order. She was helping Margaret with needlework when Timothy suddenly burst through the door, face flushed with excitement. "Miss Halloway, come quick, there's a hurt dog by the creek." Before Clara could think to be proper, she was following him out the door, Margaret close behind. They found the animal caught in a tangle of old barbed wire, whimpering and bleeding from several gashes. "Oh, the poor thing," Margaret breathed. Clara knelt beside the dog, assessing the damage. "Timothy, run to Henderson's farm. They'll have wire cutters. Margaret, we need clean water and cloth for bandages." The children scattered. Clara stayed with the dog, speaking softly, trying to keep it calm. She didn't notice Micah's approach until his shadow fell across them. "Let me," he said simply, producing wire cutters from his saddlebag. Together, they worked to free the animal. Clara held its head, murmuring soothing nonsense, while Micah carefully cut through the wire. When the children returned, they worked as a team, Timothy holding the water bucket, Margaret tearing strips of cloth, Clara cleaning wounds while Micah supported the dog's weight. "He's going to need stitches," Micah observed. "Doc Morrison knows animals as well as people." "We can't just leave him," Timothy said anxiously. We won't. Micah looked at Clara. Doc's place is a fair walk. The children could help me get him there while you maintain order at the store. Clara understood. He was giving her an excuse to stay behind, to remain the proper governess Weatherby demanded. She looked at the children's faces, hopeful, excited, alive with purpose. No, she heard herself say. We'll all go, together. The walk to Doc Morrison's was slow, with Micah carrying the injured dog and the children flanking him protectively. Clara walked slightly behind, her proper governess facade cracking with each step. By the time they reached the doctor's house, she'd given up trying to keep her skirts from dragging in the dust. Doc Morrison, a gruff man with gentle hands, took the dog without question. Might take some time, he warned. You folks can wait in the parlor. It was there, sitting on horsehair furniture with bloodstains on her dress and prairie dust in her hair, that Clara finally broke. I can't do this anymore, she said to no one in particular. Margaret moved closer. Do what, Miss Halloway? Pretend. The word came out cracked. Pretend I don't care about things. Pretend I don't have opinions. Pretend I'm not angry when Mrs. Morrison whispers about me at church. Or frustrated when your uncle forbids us from studying geography because it might give you ideas about traveling. She laughed, but it sounded like crying. I came here to escape being told I was too much, but I'm still too much. I'm just quietly too much now. Timothy climbed into her lap. Propriety be damned. We don't think you're too much. I know, sweetheart, but your children, the rest of the world's wrong. Everyone turned to look at Micah. He was leaning against the doorframe, hat in hand, expression unreadable. You feel everything, don't you? He continued. Every slight, every judgment, every time someone looks at you like you're a problem to be solved instead of a person to be known. And instead of letting it roll off, you take it in, let it change you. Clara's throat felt tight. What else am I supposed to do? Fight back. I tried that. It doesn't work. No. He crossed the room, knelt in front of her chair. You tried being louder than them. That's not the same as fighting back. Fighting back means living your truth regardless of their comfort. Means teaching these kids what you really know, not what their uncle thinks is safe. Means dancing when you want to dance and being still when you want to be still, not because someone else decided for you. He'll dismiss me. Maybe. Or maybe he'll realize those kids have learned more in your few weeks of trying than they did in a year of the last governess's propriety. Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway. Dog's going to be fine. Few days rest and he'll be good as new. Question is, who's taking him home? The children looked at each other, then at Clara with pleading eyes. I suppose, Clara said slowly. We could keep him in the shed behind the store, just until he's healed. The joy on their faces was worth whatever consequences would follow. The walk back was different. Clara didn't try to be smaller or quieter. When Margaret asked about the stars beginning to appear, Clara pointed out constellations and told their stories. When Timothy wondered aloud if the dog had a family looking for him, Clara engaged him in a discussion about animal behavior and instincts. Micah walked beside them, occasionally adding his own observations, but mostly just present. At the store, they settled the dog, now christened Courage by Margaret, in the shed with water and old blankets. The children reluctantly went to wash for supper, leaving Clara and Micah alone in the gathering dusk. Thank you, she said simply, for saying what I needed to hear. You already knew it. You just needed reminding. He studied her face. You going to be all right when Weatherby comes back? I don't know, but I'm tired of making myself small enough to be all right. She wrapped her arms around herself. My mother used to say that feelings were like water. They'd find their own level if you just contained them properly. But I think I'm more like a river. I need to move. Rivers carve canyons, Micah observed. Just takes time. And patience, and the ability to withstand everyone telling you you're eroding things that should stay solid. Or maybe you're creating new landscapes. He put his hat on, preparing to leave. For what it's worth. Clara, I've traveled a lot of places, seen a lot of people trying to be less than they are. You're the first I've met who makes being too much look like the only way worth being. He left her standing there, heart pounding with something that felt dangerously like hope. Inside, she found the children had set the table for supper. They looked at her expectantly. Tomorrow, Clara said, decision crystallizing. We're going to study botany, real botany, with Latin names and scientific classification. And if your uncle objects, I'll explain that a proper education includes understanding God's creation in all its complexity. Margaret grinned. He won't like it. No, Clara agreed. He won't, but education isn't about what makes us comfortable. It's about what makes us grow. That night, she unpacked her trunk completely for the first time since arriving. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue, was her favorite shawl, brilliant blue with gold thread. A gift from her grandmother, too bright for Ash Hollow, too bold for a proper governess. She draped it over her chair, where she'd see it first thing in the morning. If she was going to be too much, she might as well do it in color. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the usual supplies from the east. Clara recognized Charles's precise handwriting immediately, her stomach lurching as Weatherby handed her the envelope with a disapproving sniff. Personal correspondence should be kept to a minimum, he reminded her. I trust this won't become a distraction. She waited until the noon break to open it. Sitting in the small garden behind the store where the children were tending their newly planted herbs, another small rebellion that Weatherby had grudgingly allowed after she'd framed it as practical household knowledge. _My dearest Clara, it began, and she almost laughed at the presumption. I have had several months to reflect upon our dissolved engagement, and I find myself coming to a different understanding. Perhaps I was hasty in my judgment. Perhaps what I saw as excessive enthusiasm was merely a spirited nature that needed proper guidance rather than condemnation. Mother has helped me see that with the right influence, a firm but loving hand, your more challenging qualities could be channeled into appropriate wifely energy. I am prepared to forgive your impetuousness in leaving Boston without word. I am even willing to overlook your current situation, working in trade. Return at once, and we shall be married quietly. I have already begun preparing a household where your energies can be properly directed, with time and patience. I am confident you can learn to be the wife I require. Your devoted, Charles. Clara read it twice, then a third time, each word igniting a different shade of fury. Forgive her impetuousness, channel her qualities, be the wife he required. Miss Halloway, Margaret approached cautiously. Are you well? You look fierce. Clara held up the letter. Children, gather round. I want to show you something important. Timothy abandoned his weeding to join them. Clara smoothed the letter on her lap. This, she said carefully, is what we call a conditional apology. Do you know what that means? Both children shook their heads. It means someone says they're sorry, but only if you agree to become what they want. They're not sorry for hurting you. They're sorry you won't let them control you. She stood, letter in hand. Watch closely. This is what we do with conditional apologies. With deliberate precision, Clara tore the letter in half, then quarters, then eighths. The children watched, wide-eyed, as she reduced Charles's presumptuous offer to confetti. But, Timothy ventured, wasn't he asking to marry you? Isn't that good? Would it be good if someone offered you candy, but only if you promised never to speak again? Clara asked. Or if someone said they'd be your friend, but only if you stopped loving arithmetic? Understanding dawned on his face. No, that would be awful. Exactly. Clara let the pieces of letter fall like snow. Never let anyone tell you that being loved means being less. Clara? She turned to find Micah standing at the garden gate, concern etched on his features. He must have seen her tearing the letter from the street. Everything all right? Perfect, she said, and meant it. My former fiancé has graciously offered to take me back, provided I learn to be the wife he requires. Micah's expression darkened. Former fiancé? The one who said you were too much? The very same. Apparently, he's reconsidered, with proper guidance. I might yet become acceptable. Generous of him, Micah said dryly. He entered the garden, boots careful around the herb beds. You planning to take him up on it? Clara laughed. Bright, sharp, utterly inappropriate. I'd rather live in this shed with Courage. Courage is a terrible roommate, Timothy informed him seriously. He snores. So I have heard. Micah's eyes never left Clara's face. That why you destroyed the letter? Among other reasons. She brushed the last pieces from her skirt. I suppose I should feel honored. Charles Pemberton, deigning to overlook my employment in trade, willing to forgive my impetuousness, ready to channel my excessive nature into appropriate wifely energy. Man sounds like he's training a horse, Micah observed. Oh no, Clara said. He'd be far kinder to a horse. Horses are allowed to run. The children exchanged glances. Margaret, always the bolder, asked, Were you going to marry him before when you lived in Boston? I thought I was. Clara sat back down, gesturing for them to join her. I thought being chosen meant I should be grateful, that having someone tolerate my enthusiasm was better than being alone with it. But you left, Timothy said. I left. She smiled at the memory. Packed everything I owned and answered an advertisement for a position I'd never done, in a place I'd never been. My mother said I was ruining my life. But you know what? She looked at each child, then at Micah. Ruining that life was the best thing I ever did, because that life required me to be half a person, and I'd rather be too much than not enough. Speaking of being too much, Micah said, his tone casual but his eyes serious. There's a freighting job coming up, taking supplies to the mining camps in the mountains. Could use an extra hand with the inventory and accounts. Clara's heart skipped. Mr. Weatherby would never. Already asked him. Told him it would be educational for the children to learn about commerce firsthand. 3 days, there and back. Proper accommodations at the way station. He paused. Unless you need to get back to Boston. You're mocking me? I'm offering you a choice. His voice gentled. The real kind, not the kind that comes with conditions. Before the Clara could respond, Weatherby's voice called from the store. Miss Halloway, the afternoon lessons. The children scrambled to gather their gardening tools. Clara stood more slowly, pieces of Charles's letter still scattered at her feet. Think about it, Micah said. Job leaves day after tomorrow. That evening, Clara found herself restless. She tried to focus on mending but kept pricking her fingers. The children's readers lay open before her, tomorrow's lessons planned. But her mind wandered to mountain trails and open sky. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Margaret peered around the door. Can't sleep, the girl admitted. I keep thinking about the letter. Clara patted the bed beside her. Margaret climbed up, tucking her feet under her nightgown. Are you sad about not marrying that man? No, sweetheart, I'm relieved. Then why do you look worried? Clara considered how to explain. Sometimes, when you've been trying to be smaller for so long, the idea of taking up space again feels scary, even when it's what you want. Like when I was scared to answer questions in class, even though I knew the answers. Exactly like that. Margaret leaned against her shoulder. But you made me brave enough to raise my hand. Maybe Mr. Ridge can make you brave enough to whatever it is you're scared of. It's not about Mr. Ridge making me brave. I know, Margaret interrupted. It's about choosing to be brave yourself. But isn't it easier when someone believes you can be from the mouths of babes. Clara thought, "When did you get so wise?" "You taught me to pay attention." Margaret yawned. "Are you going to go on the freight trip?" "I don't know." "I think you should. Uncle Theodore is less grumpy when you're happy. And you're happy when you come back from being with Mr. Ridge." Clara walked Margaret back to her room, tucking her in with promises to think about it. But she already knew. Had known from the moment Micah offered. The choice was between safety and possibility, between half a life and a whole one. She picked up the largest piece of Charles's letter from the floor, the fragment with "properly directed" still visible. On impulse, she struck a match from the lamp and held the paper to the flame. It caught quickly, burning bright before crumbling to ash. Tomorrow, she would tell Weatherby she needed 3 days to assist with educational commerce opportunities. She would pack her split riding skirt, the one she'd hidden in her trunk, too scandalous for Ash Hollow. She would leave careful lessons for the children to complete. And then she would remember how it felt to move through the world without calculating the space she took up. "You're not too much," Micah had said. "They're just too little." Clara smiled in the darkness. Perhaps it was time to stop trying to fit in small spaces. Perhaps it was time to see just how much room she could claim. The pieces of letter scattered in the garden would blow away by morning. But Clara Bell Halloway, too loud, too passionate, too everything, would still be here, whole and uncompromising and absolutely, defiantly herself. The fire started in the Hendersons' grain storage just past midnight. Clara woke to the sound of the church bell clanging frantically, the universal signal for catastrophe in a town built of wood and hope. Through her window, she could see the orange glow painting the eastern sky. "Fire!" The shout came from the street below. "All hands, the grain store's burning!" Clara threw her shawl over her nightgown and rushed downstairs. Weatherby was already pulling on his boots, his face grave. "Stay with the children," he ordered. "Keep them inside. Keep them calm." But Margaret and Timothy were already at the top of the stairs, eyes wide with fear. "I'll keep them safe," Clara promised. Even as her heart raced, she knew what a grain fire meant. The Hendersons supplied half the town. If they lost their stores this close to winter. For an hour, they watched from the window as the town formed bucket brigades, dark figures silhouetted against the flames. Clara held the children close, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel. The fire seemed to grow rather than diminish, sparks carrying on the wind toward other buildings. Then she saw him, Micah, running straight toward the burning structure where others were backing away. Someone shouted, pointing to the upper window where a figure waved frantically. One of the Henderson boys? Trapped? "No," Clara breathed, as Micah disappeared into the smoke. Minutes stretched like hours. The children pressed closer, Margaret burying her face in Clara's shoulder. Then, movement. Micah emerged, the Henderson boy clinging to his back, both of them coughing and stumbling. Willing hands reached to help them clear of the building just as part of the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. "He's hurt," Timothy said, pointing. Even from a distance, Clara could see Micah favoring his left side, his shirt torn and darkened with what might have been blood or soot. He waved off help, turning back to the bucket line, but his movements were unsteady. "Stay here," Clara told the children firmly. "Lock the door behind me. Do not leave this room." She ran barefoot through the streets, dodging firefighters and debris. The heat hit her like a wall as she neared the fire line. She found Micah slumped against a water trough, one hand pressed to his ribs. "You fool," she said, dropping beside him. "You complete fool." He managed a weak smile. "Nice to see you too." She peeled his hand away, wincing at the long gash across his ribs. Not deep, but bleeding freely. A burn marked his shoulder where a falling ember must have caught him. "You need the doctor." Doc's setting the Henderson boy's broken leg. He tried to straighten, gasped, and settled back. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." You're bleeding and burned and probably have smoke in your lungs." "Clara." He caught her hand. "I'm all right. Just need a minute." But his skin was too hot, his breathing too shallow. Clara made a decision. "Can you walk my rooms closer than the docks? I have medical supplies." He nodded, letting her help him to his feet. They made slow progress through the chaos, Clara supporting more of his weight with each step. By the time they reached the store, he was barely conscious. The children gasped when they saw them. "Water!" Clara ordered. "Clean cloths, the medical box from the kitchen. Quickly now." She got Micah settled in a chair, working efficiently despite her shaking hands. The cut needed cleaning, the burn needed salve. She'd helped her mother tend injuries before, but never on someone who made her heart race even when he wasn't half dead from heroics. "Why?" she asked as she worked. "Why run into a burning building?" "Boy was scared," Micah mumbled. "Someone had to." "Someone, not necessarily you." His eyes, when they focused on her, were too bright. "Would you have stood by if you'd been there?" She didn't answer, knowing he was right. She would have run too. Propriety be damned. By dawn, the fire was under control, though the Hendersons had lost everything. Micah had fallen into a fevered sleep, his breathing rough but steady. Clara sent Timothy to fetch the doctor, who confirmed what she already knew: smoke inhalation, exhaustion. The wound infected despite her cleaning. He needed rest and care. "I can move him to the boarding house," Doc Morrison offered. "No." Clara didn't care how it looked. "He stays here." The doctor raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Small mercies in a night full of disasters. For 3 days, Clara barely left Micah's side. She bathed his fever, changed his bandages, spooned broth between his cracked lips when he could manage it. The children helped, bringing water and keeping watch when she had to rest. Weatherby said nothing, though his disapproval radiated from every glance. The town whispered, of course, the unmarried governess, nursing a man in her own room. Improper, scandalous, but for once, Clara didn't care. Let them talk. Micah had run into fire to save a child. She'd tend him if she pleased. It was late on the 3rd night when his fever finally broke. Clara had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, her hand resting on his to monitor his pulse. She woke to find him watching her, truly conscious for the first time since the fire. "Hey," he whispered. "Hey yourself." She blinked back tears of relief. "How do you feel?" "Like I wrestled a wildfire and lost." He tried to sit up, winced, and thought better of it. The boy. "Broken leg, some burns, but alive. Thanks to you." "Thanks to us," he corrected. "Heard you bullied Doc Morrison into letting you keep me here." "I didn't bully. I stated facts firmly." "That what you call it?" A ghost of his usual smile. "Bet the whole town's talking." "Let them." Clara straightened his blanket unnecessarily. "I've been too much since the day I arrived. Might as well add improper nurse to the list of complaints." His hand caught hers. "Clara, look at me." She did, finding his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "It's too much," he said softly. "How much you feel, how much you care, how much you give." His thumb brushed her knuckles. "But that's what saved me. Not just the nursing, the caring." "Don't," Clara whispered. "Don't make this more than it is. You were hurt. I helped. Anyone would have—" "No." His grip tightened slightly. "Not anyone. You. The woman who tears up letters from men who want to make her small. The woman who teaches children to think instead of just obey. The woman who sees someone in trouble and acts, regardless of what people might say." Clara's throat felt tight. "Micah." "I've been riding these planes for 10 years, he continued, keeping my distance, keeping things simple. Then you show up with your too much heart and your too big feelings, and suddenly simple doesn't seem like enough anymore." A knock at the door interrupted whatever Clara might have said. Margaret peered in. Miss Halloway, Uncle Theodore wants to speak with you. He's in the parlor. He looks stern. Clara sighed, pulling her hand free. I'll be right there. She stood, smoothing her wrinkled dress. She'd barely changed in 3 days, barely eaten, barely thought of anything beyond keeping Micah alive. Now, reality beckoned in the form of her employer's disapproval. Clara, Micah called as she reached the door. Whatever he says, whatever he threatens, remember you have choices, real ones. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and went to face whatever judgment awaited. Weatherby stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn when she entered. The entire town, he said quietly, is discussing my governess's inappropriate behavior, nursing a man, in her bedroom, unchaperoned for days. He was dying, Clara said simply. He was injured. The boarding house has facilities. He ran into a burning building to save a child. Your neighbor's child. Was I supposed to let him suffer because of propriety? Weatherby finally turned. You were supposed to consider your reputation, the children's reputation, my reputation. I considered a man's life more important than reputation. And that, Weatherby said heavily, is why you'll never fit properly into decent society. You feel too deeply, act too rashly, care too much about the wrong things. Clara lifted her chin. Then I suppose you'll want my resignation. For a long moment, Weatherby studied her. Then, unexpectedly, his shoulders sagged. The children, he said quietly, haven't smiled so much since their parents died. They work harder for you than they ever did for Mrs. Pettibone, and when you were nursing Ridge, they organized the household themselves, kept the store running, managed meals, even helped customers. He shook his head. They're different. You've made them different. I've made them think. You've made them brave. The admission seemed to pain him. Too brave, perhaps, but brave nonetheless. He moved to his desk, pulling out a paper. This came yesterday, from the school board in Denver. They're looking for teachers. Proper credentials required, but less concern about conventional behavior. The West needs educators more than it needs propriety. Clara took the letter, scanning its contents. A real teaching position. Better pay, a chance to shape more minds than just 2. I'll write you a reference. Weatherby continued. It seems we need different things. Miss Halloway, you need room to be whatever it is you are. And my children need stability, convention, safety. Your children, Clara said carefully, need love and the permission to be themselves. Perhaps, but I can only give what I know how to give. He looked tired suddenly, older. Ridge will recover. When he does, I suggest you both consider your futures elsewhere. Clara left the parlor feeling hollow. She'd known this was coming, had known since the barn dance that her time in Ash Hollow was limited, but knowing didn't ease the ache. She found Micah awake, Margaret and Timothy sitting on the floor beside the bed, regaling him with tales of their temporary household management. Did we tell you about Mrs. Morrison? Timothy was saying. She came in for thread and Clara taught us about markup, so I calculated her bill in my head and... He broke off when he saw Clara's face. Children, she said gently, give us a moment, please. They filed out reluctantly. Clara sank into the chair, the letter from Denver heavy in her hand. How long do we have? Micah asked. He wants me gone when you're well enough to travel. And you're going to Denver? She looked up sharply. How did you... Your face. You get this look when you're planning something that scares you. He shifted carefully, testing his ribs. It's a good opportunity. Yes, she set the letter aside. But the children will remember everything you taught them. How to think, how to question, how to be brave. He caught her hand again. Clara, you can't make yourself small enough to save everyone. Sometimes the bravest thing is to go where you can do the most good. And you? The question slipped out before she could stop it. What will you do? His smile was slow, warm despite his pallor. Well, I hear Denver's growing fast. Might be opportunities for a man who knows freight routes, if he had reason to relocate. Clara's heart stuttered. Micah. I'm not asking you to choose me, he said quickly. I'm saying you don't have to choose alone. Whatever you decide, wherever you go, you don't have to disappear to fit, not anymore. Outside, the sun was rising over Ash Hollow, painting the sky in shades of hope and possibility. The town would rebuild from the fire, as it always did. The Hendersons would start again. The children would grow, and Clara Bell Halloway would have to decide what came next. But for now, she sat beside a man who'd run into flames to save a stranger, who saw her too much heart as a gift rather than a burden, who offered choices without conditions. Rest, she told him. We'll figure out tomorrow when you're stronger. But her hand stayed in his, and neither of them let go. The night was impossibly quiet, as if the world itself held its breath. Clara sat in the worn chair beside Micah's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. 5 days since the fire, and though his fever had broken, he still drifted in and out of restless sleep. The doctor said it was normal, the body's way of healing from trauma and smoke. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that he was fighting battles in his dreams that she couldn't help him win. She'd given up any pretense of propriety after the 3rd night. What did it matter what misses? Morrison whispered at the mercantile when Micah's breathing would suddenly catch and stutter. What did she care about proper distance when his hands would clench in the sheets? Trapped in some nightmare of flames and falling beams. It was just past 2 in the morning when he woke with a gasp, eyes wild and unfocused. The boy is safe, Clara said immediately, leaning forward. You saved him. Remember, he's home with a splinted leg and a story he'll tell for years. Micah blinked, awareness returning slowly. His hand fumbled across the blanket until it found hers. You're still here. Where else would I be? Sleeping, like a sensible person. His voice was rough, scraped raw from smoke. In your own bed, with your reputation intact. My reputation was ruined the day I arrived in Ash Hollow, talking too loud and feeling too much. She squeezed his fingers gently. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't try to rescue any more people in your sleep. He turned his head to study her in the lamplight. You look exhausted. Charming. Just what every woman wants to hear. Clara. His tone shifted, becoming serious. How long since you've had a proper meal or more than an hour's sleep? She waved off his concern. I'm fine. You're not, He paused, seeming to search for words. You're pouring yourself out like water in the desert, giving everything and keeping nothing back. That's rich, coming from the man who ran into a burning building. That was different. How? He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. Because I knew the risks, calculated them, made a choice. But you don't calculate. You just feel everything, all at once, and let it sweep you along like floodwater. Clara pulled her hand back, stung. I thought you understood. I thought you, of all people. I do understand. He struggled to sit up, grimacing at the pull on his ribs. That's why I'm worried. Clara, look at me. She did, reluctantly, finding his eyes clearer than they'd been in days. It's too much, he said softly, echoing words from what felt like a lifetime ago. How much you feel, and right now, you're feeling my pain, the children's fear, Weatherby's disappointment, the whole town's judgment. You're carrying all of it. Someone has to... No. He reached out, fingers brushing her cheek where she hadn't realized tears had gathered. That's the thing about feelings. Clara, they're meant to flow through you, not drown you. You can't save everyone by taking their hurt into yourself. Then, what am I supposed to do? The question came out broken. Just feel less, care less. I've tried that. I spent weeks trying to make myself smaller, quieter, easier. It nearly killed something in me. I'm not asking you to feel less. His thumb traced the path of a tear. I'm asking you to rest, to eat something, to trust that I'll still be breathing if you close your eyes for more than a minute. I can't, she whispered. Every time I try, I see you running into that building. I see the roof falling. I think about what would have happened if... Shh, he tugged gently. And she found herself sitting on the edge of the bed, his arms carefully enfolding her despite his injuries. I'm here, singed and sore, but here. Clara let herself lean into him, just for a moment. He smelled of smoke still, and the medicinal salve she'd applied to his burns. But underneath was something essentially mica leather and prairie grass and safety. Then don't sleep, he murmured against her hair. Just feel that I'm breathing. Feel that we're both here. Feel whatever you need to feel. But stop trying to hold the whole world together by yourself. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. Long enough for her racing heart to slow. Long enough for the knot in her chest to loosen slightly. Long enough for exhaustion to finally win over vigilance. Clara. His voice was drowsy now, the effort of comforting her having taxed his limited strength. Will you do something for me? Anything. Lie down, here, next to me, just for a few hours. She stiffened. Micah, I couldn't. If someone saw, they'd see a woman too tired to care about their opinions anymore. He shifted carefully, making space. Please, I'll rest better knowing you're finally resting too. It was improper, scandalous, absolutely beyond any boundary of acceptable behavior. It was also necessary. Clara kicked off her shoes and carefully arranged herself beside him, on top of the blankets, maintaining what distance she could on the narrow bed. But Micah's arm came around her, gentle but insistent, pulling her against his uninjured side. There, he said, voice thick with approaching sleep. Now we're both where we should be. Where's that? Not alone. For the first time in 5 days, Clara truly relaxed. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong. Feel the careful rhythm of his breathing. Feel the solid warmth of another human being who didn't want her to be less than she was. Micah, she whispered into the darkness. Thank you for seeing me. All of me. Even the too much parts. His arm tightened slightly. Especially the too much parts. Sleep was pulling her under. But she had one more thing to say. I think I'm falling in love with you. She felt him smile against her hair. Think Clara Holloway. You feel everything with your whole heart. You don't think you're falling in love. Fine, she murmured, half asleep. I know. Good. His lips pressed briefly to her temple. Because I've been gone on you since the day I found you ready to fight the entire prairie with nothing but anger and a traveling trunk. That's not very long to know someone. Long enough to know you're the strongest person I've met. Strong enough to feel everything and survive it. Strong enough to hope when hoping hurts. Strong enough to stay soft in a world that wants to make you hard. You make me sound better than I am. No, I just see what you can't. That being too much isn't a flaw to fix. It's a gift to protect. Clara was fading fast, but she managed one more question. And if Denver doesn't work out, if they find me too much there too, then we'll go somewhere else. California, maybe. Or Oregon. Plenty of places in this country for people who feel too deep and dream too big. He yawned. But Clara, I think Denver's going to surprise you. I think you're going to surprise yourself. We'll see, she said, but hope was already taking root. We will, he agreed. Now sleep. Let the world take care of itself for a few hours. And finally, wrapped in the arms of a man who'd run into fire and come out believing in her still, Clara did. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of whispered giggles. Margaret and Timothy stood in the doorway, eyes wide. "We brought breakfast," Margaret announced, holding up a tray. "But you were sleeping, and Mr. Ridge said to let you rest, but then Cook made fresh biscuits and—" "It's all right," Clara said, carefully extracting herself from Micah's embrace. She was rumpled and improper and oddly at peace with it. "Bring it in." The children bustled about, setting up breakfast with exaggerated care. Micah watched them with amusement, more alert than he'd been in days. "Uncle Theodore went to the Henderson farm," Timothy reported, "to help with the rebuilding. He said to tell you he'll be back by noon." "And Mrs. Morrison came by," Margaret added. "But we told her you were indisposed. She made that face. You know the one." "The prune face," Timothy clarified, then clapped a hand over his mouth. But Clara laughed, really laughed, for the first time since the fire. "Well, I suppose I've given her plenty to prune about." "Are you really leaving?" Margaret asked suddenly. "When Mr. Ridge is better." Clara glanced at Micah, who nodded slightly. "Yes, sweetheart, your uncle thinks it's best." "But what about us?" "You," Clara said firmly, "are going to be brilliant. You're going to keep asking questions and finding answers and never let anyone tell you curiosity is unladylike. And Timothy, you're going to keep seeing the magic in numbers and patterns and never let anyone convince you that wonder is childish." "But we'll miss you," Timothy said in a small voice. "And I'll miss you terribly. But missing someone doesn't mean losing them. It just means carrying a piece of them with you wherever you go." Margaret climbed onto the bed, careful of Micah's injuries. "Promise you'll write." "Every week." "And you'll tell us about Denver." "Every detail." "And you'll be happy." Clara looked at Micah, at these children who'd taught her as much as she'd taught them, at the morning light painting possibility across the floor. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in her life, truly meant it. "I'll be happy." Because happiness, she was learning, wasn't about finding a place where you fit perfectly. It was about finding people who loved you for exactly how much space you took up. It was about choosing to feel deeply, even when feeling hurt. It was about knowing that being too much for some people simply meant you were exactly enough for the right ones. And as she sat there, sharing biscuits and laughter with a recovering hero and two brave children, Clara Halloway finally understood that she'd never been too much. She'd just been waiting for a world big enough to hold her. The abandoned church sat at the edge of town, its whitewash peeling and its bell long since stolen for scrap metal. But Clara had discovered it made an excellent classroom for the kind of lessons Theodore Weatherby would never approve. The kind where young ladies learned that their minds were meant for more than memorizing Bible verses and their voices for more than whispered agreements. It started small. Margaret had mentioned that her friend Emma Watson couldn't attend regular school because her family needed her to help with washing. Then Timothy revealed that the Martinez boys wanted to learn their letters, but their father thought education made workers soft. Before Clara quite realized what was happening, she was teaching a dozen children in the afternoons, while their parents believed them to be playing by the creek. "Miss Halloway," 12-year-old Sarah Henderson said, raising her hand properly despite the informal setting. "My ma says ladies who know too much end up alone. Is that true?" Clara paused in writing Latin botanical names on the makeshift blackboard, really just a painted piece of wood Micah had salvaged. 2 weeks had passed since the fire, and he was well enough now to help with her clandestine educational endeavors. "What do you think, Sarah?" The girl chewed her lip. "Well, you know a lot. And you're not alone. Mr. Ridge is always around." Giggles erupted from the younger children. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "Knowledge doesn't make you alone," she said. "Fear of knowledge does, when we're afraid to learn, afraid to grow, afraid to become everything we could be. That's when we isolate ourselves." "But what if people don't like who we become?" This from Emma, whose mother had recently forbidden her from attending Clara's official lessons after the dancing incident. "Then they weren't really seeing you in the first place," Clara said gently. They were seeing who they wanted you to be. The scratching of pencils on precious paper filled the afternoon air. Clara moved between her students, correcting grip here, praising effort there. Through the broken window, she could see Micah working on repairing the old fence. His movements still careful, but growing stronger each day. "Is that why you're leaving?" Margaret asked suddenly. She and Timothy had taken to joining the secret lessons, hungry for knowledge beyond their uncle's approved curriculum. "Because people here can't see you properly." Clara set down her chalk. "Partly, but also because there's a whole world of students who need teachers brave enough to show them they're allowed to be curious." "I wish you could stay and teach us forever," Emma said wistfully. "If Miss Halloway stayed," Micah said from the doorway, making several children jump. "She'd eventually run out of things to teach you, but if she goes to Denver and learns new things, she can write you letters full of fresh knowledge. Seems to me that's better than keeping her caged here." He'd brought water for the children and a meaningful look for Clara. Time to wrap up. They'd learned the hard way that parents grew suspicious if children were gone too long. As the students scattered back to their official activities, Clara began cleaning up. Micah helped, moving slowly but steadily. "Henderson approached me today," he said casually, collecting scattered slate boards. "Wants to hire me to lead a supply train to Denver. Says he heard I was heading that way anyway." Clara's heart jumped. "Are you?" "Depends." He straightened, meeting her eyes. "You still planning on taking that teaching position?" "I sent my acceptance yesterday." "Then I guess I'm heading to Denver." He paused. "Lots of freight opportunities in a growing city. Man could build a good business there. Maybe even a life." Before Clara could respond, shouts erupted from the direction of town. They rushed outside to see a crowd gathering near the general store. Clara's stomach dropped. Had Weatherby discovered the secret lessons? But as they drew closer, she realized the commotion centered on Mrs. Morrison, who stood on the store's steps holding what looked suspiciously like a letter. "Corrupting our children," the woman declared. "Teaching them to question their elders, filling their heads with ideas above their station." Clara pushed through the crowd, Micah close behind. "Mrs. Morrison." "What?" "You," the woman pointed dramatically. "This is your doing. My Rose came home yesterday talking about college. College for a girl. Said you'd been teaching the children that women could be doctors and lawyers and all manner of inappropriate things." "I taught them that women have become doctors and lawyers," Clara said evenly. "That's not corruption. It's fact. Facts that will ruin them for proper life. Mrs. Morrison waved the letter. "I've written to the Denver School Board, warned them what kind of teacher they're getting. A woman who doesn't know her place and insists on spreading her confusion to innocent minds." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sense of being too much once again. "You know what?" She stepped forward, and something in her posture made Mrs. Morrison step back. "You're absolutely right. I don't know my place, because the place you'd assign me is too small for who I am." She looked around at the gathered faces, some hostile, some curious, some secretly sympathetic. "I've spent months trying to make myself fit into your idea of proper, speaking softer, moving less, feeling smaller. And you know what I learned? There's no amount of shrinking that will ever be enough for people who are afraid of growth." "Clara," Micah said quietly, a warning and an encouragement all at once. But she was beyond stopping. "Yes, I taught your daughters they could be more than wives and mothers if they choose. I taught your sons that strength comes in many forms. I taught all of them to ask questions, to wonder why, to imagine what if that makes me dangerous, then I'll wear that label with pride." "You'll wear it alone," Mrs. Morrison spat. "No decent man will have a wife who refuses to know her place." "Then it's fortunate I'm not looking for a man who wants me to be less than I am." Clara felt Micah's hand brush hers, a silent support. "I'd rather be alone and whole than married and diminished." Brave words from a woman running away to Denver, someone called from the crowd. Clara laughed, bright and sharp and utterly inappropriate. Running away, I'm running toward students who need teaching, toward a city big enough for ambition, toward a life where being too much might actually be just enough. And she won't be alone. Everyone turned as Micah stepped forward. He looked steadier than he had in days. Color returned to his face, conviction clear in his voice. I've watched this woman pour everything she has into your children, he continued. Seen her teach them to think, to dream, to believe they're capable of more than this town tells them they can be. If that threatens you, maybe you should ask yourself why. Of course you'd defend her. Mrs. Morrison sneered. Everyone knows she compromised herself nursing you, probably trapped you into... Enough! Weatherby's voice cut through the growing ugliness. He stood in his shop doorway, children flanking him. Mrs. Morrison, you've said your piece. Now let these people get on with their day. The crowd began to disperse, but not before Clara caught glimpses of her secret students. Sarah Henderson gave a tiny wave. Emma Watson mouthed, "Thank you." Even Rose Morrison looked conflicted behind her mother's rigid back. Inside the store, Weatherby regarded Clara with his usual disapproval. That was quite a display. I know. I'll pack my things immediately. You'll stay until the agreed-upon date. His tone brooked no argument. I'll not have it said I dismissed you without cause. You've 5 more days to wrap up the children's lessons properly. Clara blinked. Sir? 5 days, he repeated. Use them wisely. That evening, Clara stood once more in the abandoned church. But she wasn't alone. Word had spread in that mysterious way of small towns, and her classroom was packed. Not just children, some of their mothers too, the ones who'd always watched her with curiosity rather than condemnation. We don't have long, Clara said, looking at the assembled faces. But there are things I want you to know before I go. She taught until her voice grew hoarse. Not facts and figures this time, but something more important. Permission. Permission to wonder. Permission to want more. Permission to be too much in a world that would always try to make them less. When the lesson ended and the crowd dispersed, only Micah remained. He'd been sketching in the corner throughout, capturing the scene in pencil strokes. Let me see, Clara said, reaching for his notebook. He handed it over. There she was, surrounded by eager faces, arms raised mid-gesture, face alive with passion. But it wasn't the accuracy that made her throat tight. It was how he'd drawn her, not as too much, but as exactly right. This is how you see me. This is how you are. He took the notebook back, tearing out the page. Keep it, for the days in Denver when you doubt yourself. And if I don't doubt myself? Then keep it for the days you miss Ash Hollow. Will I miss it? She looked around the broken church that had become her sanctuary. This place that tried so hard to make me small. You'll miss the children, the potential you saw, the lives you touched even when they didn't want to be touched. He folded the drawing carefully, placing it in her hands. And maybe you'll miss the man who saw you being too much and thought finally, someone who matches the size of the sky. Clara pressed the paper to her chest. That man is coming to Denver. He is, but not for you to lean on, just to be near, to watch you become whatever it is you're meant to become. And if what I become is even more than I am now, then Denver better brace itself. He smiled. Clara Bell Holloway is coming to town, and she's done apologizing for the space she takes up. 5 days. 5 more days to plant seeds that might bloom long after she left. 5 days to say goodbye to the first place that had challenged her to be truly herself, even as it rejected what it found. Clara looked at the equations still chalked on her makeshift board, at the books she'd borrowed from Doc Morrison's personal library, at the man who'd helped her build this small revolution. She'd come to Ash Hollow to hide. She was leaving it to soar. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of how high she might fly. The drought began in late July. creeping across the prairie like a slow death. At first, it was just the usual summer dry spell, crops wilting a little, wells running lower. But by the second week of August, with Clara's departure only days away, Ash Hollow faced genuine crisis. The meeting was called for Sunday afternoon, after church services that had been dominated by prayers for rain. Clara sat in the back of the town hall, ostensibly there to mind the Weatherby children, but really because crisis had a way of making people forget propriety, even Mrs. Morrison was too worried about her withering garden to glare at the improper governess. Mayor Hutchins stood before the assembled townspeople, his usually florid face drawn with worry. "The situation is this: we've got maybe 3 weeks of water if we're careful. The Henderson well is already dry. The creek's down to a trickle." Murmurs of fear rippled through the crowd. Clara had seen droughts in the east, but here, with no alternative water sources for miles, the threat was existential. "What about the old Miller well?" someone called out. "The deep one." "Collapsed years ago," Hutchins replied. "Would take weeks to dig it out, and we don't know if it'd yield anything." "Then we ration harder," Mrs. Morrison declared. "Cut everyone to half portions." "We're already at half portions," Sarah Henderson's father pointed out. "Cut more and the children suffer first." The arguing began in earnest then. Who deserved water? Who could do without? Whose crops were most vital? Clara watched it unfold with growing frustration. They were fighting over scarcity instead of seeking solutions. "What about the underground spring?" Her voice cut through the noise. Everyone turned to stare. "What spring?" Mayor Hutchins asked. Clara stood, ignoring the weight of disapproving eyes. "The children and I found it during our nature walks. About 2 miles north, where the cottonwoods grow in that odd cluster. The ground there is always damp, even in dry spells. Classic signs of an underground water source." "You're not a geologist, Miss Halloway." "Mrs." Morrison said coldly. "No, but I can read and think and observe." Clara moved to the front of the room. "The cottonwoods grow in a perfect circle. That usually indicates a natural spring that's been covered over by sediment. If we waste precious time and energy digging where some Eastern woman thinks there might be water, we could all die of thirst." Someone interrupted. "Or we could find water and survive." Clara shot back. The room erupted again. Through the chaos, Clara caught Micah's eye. He nodded slightly. He'd seen the place she meant, understood what she was suggesting. "I'll dig," he said, voice carrying over the noise. Silence fell. "I'll dig," he repeated. "Starting tomorrow. If Miss Halloway's wrong, I've wasted my own energy. If she's right, we all benefit." "I'll help," Tom Henderson added, surprising everyone. "My well's already dry. Got nothing to lose." "And me," said James Martinez, whose fields were dying despite his best efforts. One by one, men began volunteering. Even some women offered to help haul dirt and rocks. But the town remained divided, half desperate enough to try anything, half convinced it was foolishness. Theodore Weatherby stood slowly. "This is precisely the sort of chaos that comes from entertaining wild ideas from excitable women. However," he glanced at his wards, both of whom were watching Clara with shining eyes, "I suppose desperate times call for unconventional measures. The store will provide shovels and buckets on credit." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was support. Clara felt a surge of something like vindication. The next morning dawned cloudless and merciless. Clara arrived at the Cottonwood Grove to find a dozen people already there, tools in hand. Micah was marking out the dig site based on her observations. "You should be packing," he told her. "Denver won't wait. Denver can have me covered in dust or not at all." Clara grabbed a bucket. "Besides, I started this. I'll see it through." They dug in shifts through the brutal heat. Clara's hands blistered, her dress soaked with sweat. But she didn't stop. Margaret and Timothy brought water from the town's dwindling supplies, rationing it carefully among the workers. By noon, they were 6 feet down with no sign of moisture. Some began to mutter about wasted effort. "Maybe you were wrong," Emma Watson said gently. She'd been helping despite her mother's forbiddance. "It happens." "No." Clara studied the soil they were bringing up. "Look at this. See how it's changing, getting darker. That means—" A shout from the pit interrupted her. James Martinez held up a handful of mud, actual mud, not just damp earth. "Keep digging," Clara called, energy renewed. 2 feet more and they hit it. Water, seeping up through sandy soil. Slow but steady. A cheer went up from the workers. Within an hour, they had a functioning well, crude but producing clear, cold water. Word spread like wildfire. Soon the entire town had gathered, watching as bucket after bucket came up full. Even Mrs. Morrison looked grudgingly impressed. "Don't celebrate yet," Mayor Hutchins warned. "We need to see if it'll last. If there's enough—" "There's enough," Clara said firmly. "This isn't surface water that'll dry up. It's a true spring. It's been here all along, just waiting for someone to look past the obvious." She caught Micah's eye as she said it, saw his small smile. They both knew she was talking about more than water. That evening, as the town organized water distribution from the new well, Clara found herself standing with the Weatherby children at the edge of the grove. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, green and thriving despite the drought. "You saved us," Margaret said simply. "No, I just paid attention. Any of you could have done the same. But we didn't," Timothy pointed out. "We were too scared to speak up, even when we noticed things." "Well," Clara knelt to their level. "Now you know better. Now you know that sometimes the strange idea, the different perspective, the too much observation, sometimes that's exactly what's needed." "Uncle Theodore says you can stay now," Margaret added hopefully. "He says anyone who can find water in a drought deserves reconsideration." Clara's heart squeezed. "That's kind of him, but my path leads elsewhere." "Even though you're a hero now?" Timothy asked. "I'm not a hero. I'm a teacher who got lucky." She hugged them both. "And Denver has students who need teaching just as much as Ash Hollow needed water." Later, as the sun set over the prairie, Clara sat with Micah by the new well. The sounds of a grateful town celebrating drifted on the evening air. "You could stay," he said quietly. "They'd accept you now. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Would you want me to—" He considered this. "I want you to choose what makes you feel most alive. If that's staying here where you finally won some approval, then stay. But if it's going to Denver where no one knows you're supposed to be too much?" He shrugged. "Then go. And you? I told you, where you go, I go, not because you need me, but because I want to see what happens next." He gestured toward the well. "You saw water where everyone else saw dust. What else might you see that the rest of us miss?" Clara leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. Tomorrow there would be decisions to finalize, bags to pack, goodbyes to say, but tonight, she'd given a dying town hope. She'd proven that being too observant, too insistent, too unwilling to accept the obvious could save lives. Mrs. Morrison still hates me," she observed. "Mrs. Morrison hates anyone who makes her question her certainties." He put his arm around her. "But did you see her daughter Rose was taking notes while you explained about the cottonwoods? That girl's going to be a scientist someday. Mark my words." "Because I was too much. Because you were exactly enough to show her it was possible." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to appear. The drought would continue for weeks more, but Ash Hollow would survive. The new well would sustain them. And somewhere in this town, children would remember the too-much woman who'd saved them by refusing to see only what everyone else saw. "I'm still going to Denver," Clara said finally. "I know. But I'm glad I could do this first. Glad I could give them something before I left." You gave them more than water. Clara! Micah's voice was warm with pride. You gave them proof that different doesn't mean wrong. That's going to last longer than any well. She hoped he was right, but even if he wasn't, even if they forgot her the moment she left, she'd know. She'd know that her too much observation, her too deep thinking, her too fierce insistence had made the difference between life and death. And that was worth all the whispers in the world. The Autumn Harvest Festival had always been Ash Hollow's way of giving thanks for survival. This year, with the drought broken and the new well flowing steady, the celebration carried extra meaning. Clara had meant to leave before it began, but the Denver School Board had granted her a week's delay, and the town had convinced her to stay for one last gathering. The entire main street had been transformed. Tables groaned under the weight of preserved foods, late vegetables coaxed from rescued gardens, and fresh bread baked with carefully rationed supplies. Lanterns hung from every post, and Sam Peterson's fiddle was already tuning up for the evening's dance. Clara wore her blue dress, the same one from that first dance months ago, but somehow it fit differently now, or perhaps she inhabited it differently, no longer trying to shrink herself to match others' expectations. You ready? Micah appeared at her boarding house door, dressed in his finest clothes. He'd recovered fully from the fire, though he still carried a faint scar across his ribs, a reminder of the night everything changed. For my last dance in Ash Hollow, Clara smiled. I suppose I have to be. They walked toward the celebration together, and Clara was struck by how different this felt from that first barn dance. Then, she'd been desperately trying to contain herself. Now, she moved freely, spoke easily, existed without apology. Miss Halloway, Sarah Henderson rushed up, cheeks flushed with excitement. Look what I found! She held up a rock with clear crystalline formations. Is this quartz, like you taught us? It certainly is. See how it catches the light. Clara examined the specimen. That's a beautiful find. Sarah. I'm going to study rocks, the girl announced. Real studying. Like scientists do. Papa says if I still want to when I'm older, he'll consider sending me to college. Clara's throat tightened. That's wonderful, sweetheart. More children approached as they entered the festival proper, her secret students, her official pupils, children who'd simply absorbed her lessons from the edges. Each had something to share, an observation about nature, a mathematical pattern they'd noticed, a question about the wider world. You see, Micah murmured, seeds planted, growing wild. Even Mrs. Morrison, stationed importantly by the punch bowl, managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. Her daughter Rose stood nearby, deep in conversation with Emma Watson about the books Clara had left them, texts on botany and basic chemistry that would have horrified their mothers months ago. Theodore Weatherby approached with measured steps. Miss Halloway, Mr. Ridge. Mr. Weatherby. Clara braced herself for one last disapproval. Instead, he held out an envelope, a letter of recommendation. For Denver, I've been perhaps too rigid in my thinking. The children have flourished under your care, even if your methods were unconventional. Clara took the letter, speechless. They'll miss you, he continued, glancing at Margaret and Timothy, who were helping with harvest decorations. As will I, though I doubt you'd believe that. Sir, You saved this town, Miss Halloway, not just with the well, but with perspective. I pray Denver appreciates what they're getting. He nodded curtly and walked away before Clara could respond. Did Theodore Weatherby just compliment you? Micah asked, wonderingly. I think he did. Clara tucked the letter carefully into her pocket. Will wonders never cease? The fiddle struck up a lively reel, and couples began forming for the dance. But before Clara could join them, Mayor Hutchins climbed onto a makeshift platform. Friends, neighbors, he called out. Before we commence with the festivities, I believe we owe a debt of gratitude. Clara tried to shrink back, but Micah's hand at her elbow kept her in place. "Miss Clara Halloway," the mayor continued, "came to us as a stranger. Some of us," he glanced meaningfully at certain faces in the crowd, "made her feel unwelcome, called her too much, too loud, too everything." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. "But when crisis came, when our wells ran dry and our crops withered, who saw what we couldn't, who insisted on hope when we'd resigned ourselves to despair?" He raised his glass. "To Miss Halloway, too much turned out to be exactly what Ash Hollow needed." The toast was taken up across the crowd, some enthusiastically, some grudgingly, but taken up nonetheless. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Speech," someone called out. Clara shook her head, but the call was taken up by others. "Finally." Micah nudged her forward. "One more lesson," he suggested. She climbed carefully onto the platform, looking out at the assembled faces, her students, her critics, her unexpected community. "I came to Ash Hollow running from myself," she began, voice carrying clear in the evening air. "I'd been told I was too much, too emotional, too opinionated, too unwilling to fit the shape others had decided for me. I thought perhaps here, in a new place, I could learn to be less." She found the Weatherby children in the crowd, their faces bright with attention. "Instead, you taught me something precious. You can't selectively diminish yourself. You can't be less passionate without being less compassionate. You can't speak softer without thinking smaller. You can't shrink your heart without shrinking your capacity to help." Her eyes found Micah, steady and sure at the platform's edge. "Yes, I'm too much. I feel too deeply, speak too freely, hope too wildly. But that same too muchness let me love your children fiercely enough to teach them to think. It let me see water where others saw only dust. It let me stay when leaving would have been easier." She took a breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Tomorrow, I leave for Denver. I go knowing that some of you will be glad to see the back of me, but I also go knowing that I've left seeds in your children's minds, in your soil, in the proof that different perspectives can save lives. Water those seeds. Let them grow wild and strange and beautiful. Let them be too much." She stepped down to applause, not universal, but genuine from those who mattered. The music resumed, and this time when Micah offered his hand, Clara took it without hesitation. They danced as the stars came out, as the harvest moon rose full and golden over the prairie. Other couples swirled around them, but Clara was aware only of the solid warmth of Micah's presence, the certainty of his touch. "No holding back this time," he murmured as he spun her. "Never again," she agreed, letting her laughter ring bright across the square. They danced every dance, even when proper ladies would have rested. Clara's hair escaped its pins. Her skirts flew wide, her joy radiated unchecked. And this time, when people stared, she met their eyes and smiled. During a brief pause for musicians to rest, Margaret and Timothy approached. "We have something for you," Margaret said shyly, producing a small wrapped package. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and beautiful. The first page contained pressed flowers from their nature walks, and a message in 2 different hands. Asterisk for Miss Halloway, who taught us that questions are more important than answers, that being curious is not the same as being troublesome, that feeling deeply is not a weakness but a strength. Write to us about everything. With love and too much feeling. Margaret and Timothy asterisk. Clara hugged them both, not caring that tears were streaming down her face. "I'll write every week, I promise." "And we'll write back," Timothy said firmly, "with all our questions and observations and too much thoughts." The final dance was announced, a slow waltz to close the evening. Micah led Clara back onto the floor, and she noticed how many of her students were watching, memorizing this moment of their too-much teacher being perfectly, wholly herself. "You know what I realized?" Micah said as they swayed together. "What's that?" "A year from now, when they tell stories about tonight, Half the town will claim they always knew you were special. They'll forget they ever called you too much. They'll say they saw your value from the start. Clara laughed softly. Let them. What matters is that the children will remember the truth. And what truth is that? She thought for a moment, then smiled. That being too much isn't something to fix. It's something to celebrate. That the world needs people who feel too deeply, hope too wildly, refuse to fit in spaces too small for their spirits. Speaking of not fitting, Micah pulled her closer as the music swelled. Denver has no idea what's coming. No, Clara agreed, thinking of the classroom waiting for her, the minds ready to be opened, the future sprawling wide with possibility. But they're about to find out. The music ended, but they stayed in each other's arms a moment longer. Around them, Ash Hollow prepared to return to its routines, its small certainties, its careful boundaries. But something had shifted, in rescued gardens and questioning children, in a well that shouldn't exist, and women reading books they weren't supposed to understand. Clara's too-muchness had taken root. Tomorrow, she and Micah would load their belongings onto a wagon headed west. They would ride toward Denver and whatever adventures awaited. But tonight, under the harvest moon, in a town that had taught her to stop apologizing for her abundance, Clara Belle Halloway danced. She danced like water finding its way through stone, like seeds breaking through hard ground, like a woman who'd learned that being too much was just another way of being enough. And in the morning, when the sun painted the prairie gold and the wagon wheels started turning, she would carry Ash Hollow with her, not as the place that tried to make her small, but as the place where she finally grew too large to contain. The too-much teacher and the man who loved her for it, riding toward a horizon big enough for all their hopes. Finally, beautifully, unapologetically whole. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Clara's journey resonated with you. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's share our own experiences of being too much or finding the courage to be ourselves. If you enjoyed this tale from the American frontier, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who might need to hear that being too much is really just being enough. Until our next adventure in the Old West, keep feeling deeply and living boldly.